Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on queer studies and activism in the Middle East. Today, I will be in conversation with Riva Saik, Sabiha Alouche, and Ghassan Moussawi. My name is Nadia Ali, and I'm currently the director of Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. So let me introduce today's guest to you. Riva Saik is a queer feminist writer, publisher, and archivist from Lebanon. Welcome, Riva. She is the founding editor of Kohl, a journal of body and gender research, and the co-founder of Intersectional Knowledge Publishers. She's currently based in Paris, France, where she's pursuing an MA in gender studies at Université Paris 8 Vincennes Saint-Denis. She's passionate about the intersections of sex and sexuality, queer geographies and migration, global economies, and feminist histories. I would also like to welcome and introduce to you Sabiha Alouche. Sabiha obtained her PhD in gender studies from SOAS University in London in 2018. She is an interdisciplinary researcher whose work bridges the gap between political analysis and anthropological writing. She's on the advisory board of Kohl and lectures at the University of Exeter's Politics Department. Sabiha dedicates herself to producing decolonized knowledge and uncovering the racialized, sexed, and gendered logics that constitute our world. You can read her publications in Kohl and several Middle East academic journals. Welcome, Sabiha. And now I'd like to introduce to you Ghassan Moussawi. Ghassan is assistant professor of gender and women's studies and sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He works and teaches in the areas of transnational gender and sexuality studies, racialized sexualities, queer theory, and queer of color critique. And of course, today part of today's conversation will be around his recently published book, which I have here. Disruptive Situations, Fractal Orientalism and Queer Strategies in Beirut. And the book focuses on everyday life disruptions and violence and queer formations in post-war Beirut. Welcome, Ghassan, welcome all of you. I'm so happy that we'll be in conversation today. Now, those of you who have been following our events this year know that I have been trying to open up a space for discussions and conversations around the centrality of gender and sexuality in our attempts at analyzing, understanding, and engaging with processes, trends, and phenomena linked to the Middle East and its diasporas. And here, what has become more and more apparent are the intersections of patriarchy, heteronormativity, with a range of issues linked to authoritarianism, militarism, sectarianism, and so on. But gender and sexuality are also key in the various forms of resistance and mobilization against authoritarian governance and different forms of inequalities and injustices. And in today's event, what I'd like to do is focus specifically on queer studies as an angle and queer activism as a form of resistance in the context of the Middle East. And I've personally been quite interested in the relation and tensions between feminist movements and thought and LGBTQ movements and approaches in the region historically and in contemporary context, as well as the relationship between the more liberal, rights-based LGBT activism as opposed to queer feminist approaches and activism. And Riva and myself have written about this in a chapter, mainly with reference to Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq. Now, some of you who are attending today's event might have also attended the launch of the most recent issue of Kohl on queer feminism. The launch was definitely extremely special and was a wonderful event. But what also became apparent was that it was part of a much longer development and process in which Kohl, but also a whole range of activists, researchers, and academics have been collaborating, thinking, reflecting on what queer feminism might mean and what it could do. And Ghassan, who is with us, is of course one of them, and his book fits into that trajectory as well. So what we're going to do, I'll be in conversation with my guest today for about an hour or so, and I encourage you to post your questions or comments in the Q&A function, and we will have at least half an hour at the end for discussion. So at any time, if you have a question, please put it in. And also, if you know of anyone, who would like to listen to our conversation in Arabic, there is translation available. So you just go to the interpretation function and click on the Arabic button. Okay. Okay, let me start with you, Riva. And of course, I have to say that it's been such a great privilege and amazing learning opportunity to have been involved with Kohel, with the journal, as an advisory board member. And I'm extremely grateful, for this opportunity. And I was wondering if you could introduce the idea behind Kohel to us and to tell us, how the journal links feminist queer knowledge production and activism. And also, of course, I've been involved as an advisory board member for 5 years, and I've seen, there have been lots of transformations and shifts. Can you speak a little bit about these developments over the 5 years as well?
Hello, and thank you so much. Let me start by expressing how wonderful it is to be here. And thank you, Nadia, for inviting me and organizing this. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists or co-conversationists, Sabiha, who's been a rock in the past year and a half with her wisdom and generosity, and Ghassan, whose book speaks intimately to me, as it portrays queer life as a tactic of doing politics. And maybe this can link into what you've just asked me in terms of, the different developments that we've seen in Kohel. And I think it really inscribes in the as part of a much larger development that has to do with queer knowledge as praxis that we are seeing at the margins of institutions and geographies as well. So it is a kind of knowledge and praxis that is really Southern and that challenges how is it that we traditionally see the sites of knowledge and power. And maybe my entry point here, instead of it being Kohel, it's a bit unorthodox, but what I would like to do in order to maybe understand what has informed those changes in Kohel is to really start by taking a moment to talk about what is going on in Lebanon right now. Just to reflect a bit on the sheer horror of hopelessness and despair that settle in as a new kind of normal, because this is the reality of capitalism, it is the reality of power and greed and control and extractivism. But in a way, maybe, and to think of this tradition, okay, the tradition of queer knowledge as praxis. What is new to us is not new to others. In fact, it seems to be a recurring political weapon, and I'm talking here about, economic collapse and inflation and crisis that is mobilized particularly in West Asia or the Middle East, which is where we are talking from, as well as other parts of the global South. And maybe to understand what an archive like Kohel would do in terms of, queer knowledge and queer discourse, maybe we can take a look at the discourse that is out there right now about what's going on in Lebanon. So when we look at headlines, it says running out of time, what next, a matter of when, not if. So it's as if it's some sort of video game or spectacle that seems to be entertaining or even like enjoyable to an outside gaze. And so this is what being consumed feels like. And I think we've always resisted to this notion of being consumed, and we can talk about it later. In terms of what the reality is, like the material reality is, there's a feeling of being stuck between different sites of power. You have the IMF, the World Bank, states promising aid, wanting to discipline and punish the politicians on the one hand. And how could we not take a stance on this kind of, game that happens on the international global scene? And on the other hand, we have the corrupt system held by sectarian warlords that would not budge and that still employs the same methods of terror and intimidation and repression. So basically, what it does to us and our understanding of queer knowledge and praxis is maybe reinforce this idea or further erode the master's tools as tools that we can use. So we can no longer count our gains as progress, because our gains are not quantifiable, they cannot be linear. And in that regard, Kohl's praxis as an exercise of opening up, of creating that which will not be given to us, is something that we've been doing like throughout the years, but I think is something that has become really dear to us in the past 2 to 3 years, given everything that's been going on. So why is a political project like Kohl that mobilizes queer knowledge production a form of activism? On the surface, it has accompanied these questionings in its praxis as they unfolded. So we were very much concerned at the beginning of Kohl being created with the consumption aspect of things, and particularly what we called back then Western consumption. We still are in a way, but I think we have thought alongside those who came before us, those who happen to be in overlapping spaces and times, like Ghassan with us today, I hope. And the idea is not only to document what is out there, but to archive it with our bodies, to imagine what could be, to live by that praxis, and to live alternatives, and alternatives that are queer alternatives, not as an identity, but as a political worldview. And this is the work that Kohl is concerned with right now.
Thanks so much, Riva, and I also really appreciate that you sort of started out by reminding us, of course, of the, situation in Lebanon, and too often we're kind of, talking in the abstract, and these very sort of real material realities, which of course are sort of multi-layered, and clearly, I mean, another element is the pandemic that is, in fact, I mean, that is already happening in a context of very harsh inequalities and forms of injustices. And yeah, thanks for that. Sabiha, if I may turn to you and follow up. I mean, so I know that your involvement in Kohl is more recent. You joined maybe a couple of years ago, the advisory board, but of course you've been following and reading and being, I mean, I know you've been following closely what Kohl has been producing, but now you're sort of at the heart of it, and you've been actually very much involved in the workshop that eventually led to the production of the queer feminism issue. So, the idea of bringing people together in a workshop in Beirut. And I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on that experience of being part of that workshop, and then the process to then the publication of the Kohl special issue on queer feminism.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. Well, I think to answer this question, I was indeed, I did join Kohl a bit later, but actually I also entered academia quite late. I wrote my first essay ever when I wrote my MA. My BA was in a vocational route. It was completely different from what we understand as high theorizing. And also, I'm not an activist by trade. I confronted my privilege really quite late in life, I would say. And when I was at that workshop, like just to sit there at 40 years of age, listening to all these brilliant minds and really young, like there was at least a generation, easily a generation between me and most of our authors, and listening to them express, right, their version of in-betweenness, but also like coming of age in this, all these material conditions that Riwa have just told us about. And it just really made me realize that maybe the whole world is basically wrong, right? Maybe the young should lead and we should follow. And this seems to be really um, my newfound motto, I guess. Everything I seem to produce and think about this day is maybe the young should lead and we should follow. And by we, I mean supposedly the experts, those that are more established, those that have done their homeworks of being a responsible citizen, contributing to life, paying our taxes, etc. And this realization is really one great way to capture, I hope, right, the reach and the scope of queer studies, literally to turn the world upside down, but also to live your life um, as per the future that you envisage. And there was a lot of, I would say, there was some cynicism a little bit. There were some, the infamous imposter syndrome, right, manifesting. Um, um, Sometimes even a disconnect. If you just looked at all of us, like there was just a clear disconnect between us, but there was also this spontaneity and instantaneous attachment to a political project that, you know, happened sooner than expected. Like the workshop lasted 4 days, and I think it took, I don't know, half a day, maybe just after the first coffee break. I mean, coffee and biscuits always help for it, right, to become clear. And it made things really easier from that point onwards. Because even though the state, like the violence of the state was present, or the nuclear family, or religion, or migration, etc., and all these realities were part and parcel of not only the analysis, right, that was being undertaken, but it clearly was evident, like this is part and parcel of our everyday life, right? And but also what happened during the workshop, and maybe I'm not the best person to speak about it on this point, is because I did not join, at some point we all went to join the revolution that was happening, in the street. And it wasn't a workshop that, no one was reinventing, like, it was really raw, like the way it was written down. This is a lived reality, a theory that comes from the lived reality, the powerful working of theory, being able to construct a we based on all these seemingly disconnected eyes, really became evident there. And like, just to give you an idea, so you have the workshop, you join the revolution. At some point we ate at an Armenian restaurant, and we're talking about all these different bodies from, so we had Pakistan, Sudan, Turkey, Egypt, Kuwait, diasporic people. And like, you just sit there and you eat this Armenian food and you're like, like, what does it mean, right, for our Armenian, for example, peers in Lebanon to be stuck in this state that one day swears allegiance to, Turkey, one day to another Sunni entity? What about, the Armenian roots? What about not finding support, right, around you in terms of, for example, the Armenian history? And it just like, you can't afford not to be aware, right, of the world map and of the geopolitics and the events that happen around you. And in that sense, theorizing became feasible. And I'm going to be very honest, at some point I felt very much like like, I don't want to say imposter, intruder. I felt like I was the academic one. And at some, maybe until the second day, I was convinced that I was the responsible one who was supposed to slow things down. Should we get too experimental? Should we become too sophisticated theoretically? Because I'm being sarcastic here, but we're not supposed to theorize, right? We're supposed to apply queer theory. But before I knew it, I was like, forget your books, forget your theoretical framework. And I'm sure sitting next to Riwa definitely made this easier, because, she would be like, why are you coming back here to the theory? It took me time to get into it. And of years having spent reading this material, I should have been more experienced, and I should have been less attached to the theory, right? And more aware by virtue of my expertise that, you can let go of theory, but it wasn't easy, to do. And so, yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for reflecting on your experiences. I mean, I guess for me, listening and to this, and I've heard some of it before. It also really sort of brings back what I associate with Kohol, or some of the things that I associate with Kohol. One is the bridging in terms of academic and activist knowledge, but also very importantly, those of us who are academics and who work in the kind of academic world, we know that journals are not places where you get lots of mentorship and where people support you, and where the focus is on process, the focus is on product. And many of us will be traumatized by the comments of the peer reviewers, and be made to feel inadequate. And I think one of the amazing things, and one of the things I really like about Kohol, that the emphasis is so much on that process and the creating that space and mentorship. And if you have a good idea, Kohol will try everything to make sure that you'll be published, instead of putting you down because you didn't reference properly or you didn't develop the conceptual framework. And I think that's really important, because we don't have many spaces that are so welcoming and allow that. So I feel that's, and you described it so well in that workshop. Maybe a follow-up question to both of you, Riva and Sabiha, which is, I mean, you mentioned it in different ways, but I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on the relationship between praxis, activism, and theory when it comes to queer studies and activism. Riva, you want to go first?
Sure. So yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think it's at the center of what we do in terms of, writing ourselves back in as affect. And I think it's really hard to pinpoint, what that praxis looks like, because putting it into words feels a bit like putting it in a box, like making it legible and therefore consumable. But linking to what you just said, Nadia, about the processes, what I will try to do here is to break down processes, because it's always confusing. Like, what is Kohol, for example? Is it an activist journal? Is it an academic journal? It's really unclear, and I think the lines are blurry. But I think that the dichotomy no longer is no longer there when we think of how is it that we work through those processes as praxis. So first, maybe thinking about the many locations of our activism and praxis as places and spaces where we spill into. So as Aya said at the launch event, from workshop to revolution to drag shows, and that Sabiha pointed to early just now. And this way of, spilling into space, of occupying space, is part of, not being isolated in one category or one way or doing things or one context. Another process that we do is this work of sitting circles, where writing, like I don't understand why writing always has to be seen as this kind of individualistic endeavor that goes through the writing, processes that you described, Nadia. So maybe the idea is to create queer tables, even writing circles that are virtual with the pandemic conditions that we are living under right now. So by creating queer tables, what we can do is then really think about knowledge that's collaborative, maybe not in the product, but how is it that we get there? And this thinking together, this togetherness, I call it a work of shaking. So shaking is affect, but also shaking worlds. And because of this shaking, this affect, this writing ourselves back in, theory in the flesh means exactly that. Theory becomes activism, becomes a site where work can happen, as is apparent in the Kohl's issue on queer feminisms. And another process is work that is uncomfortable, because I don't want to romanticize, those spaces and those ways of doing. It is community work. So it's a work that requires us to fail at times, so we can better imagine ways of togetherness that are not based on, the systems we have been criticizing and want to do away with, that are carceral, that are, driven by police logic, the master's tools. So it's work that not only undoes binaries, but, to borrow from and be inspired by Keguro Macharia, that wanders away. So it's not about East and West. It's not about theory and activism. It's not about global and local, because it's so easy to get caught up with all of that. But then when do we do what we really want to do? When do we have space for this work? So writing ourselves back in is writing as doing, writing as praxis. And queerness as a practice of world making, to think of those binaries that we wander off from. So queerness as a practice of world making that we do is something that we do, not something we respond to, basically.
Yeah, thanks so much, Riva. Sabiha, would you like to also add something?
It's very difficult to add these beautiful words, but I really want to insist on, this idea of when you are, when we're tackling embodied knowledge, when we're tackling embodied violence, every word we write is collaborative, because it does rely, on somebody's lived experience, on somebody's past violences. There are traces, right, of the flesh in it, in all this theorizing. And theorizing can be absolutely like pedagogical, right? It can give you the tools to find the words, to express yourself, to do it. And I agree with everything that Riwa said. So this is what we do, right? Maybe on the side, but I find myself increasingly in my work at the university, when you transform all this theory or all this theorizing, when you write yourself back in, really what you're doing is, I don't even know if it's writing yourself back in. It's rediscovering yourself, and it gives you a lot of confidence and self-assertion to do certain things. And now I use myself, for example, today I find myself using my power position in the university to deal with a lot of the injustices, I would say epistemic injustices I used to not know how to deal with in my inbox. People who want my free labor, my contacts, my networks, my expertise. Okay, who are you collaborating with from the region? Where are the research projects that go to speak to these activists? What is the grassroots works that you're doing? Where is the praxism you're doing? Nothing, nada. We're just theorizing, you know, and we need your contacts. I do it with graduate students, PhD applicants. Is their positionality clear? Am I receiving another proposal about saving women, about saving gays? Because nobody needs saving. And this is why we need these strong, right, spaces of collaborative work, of writing circles, you know, whatever it is. I do it the same also with the peer reviewers. Like, you know, when I'm asked to review for journals, where are the gaps in race? Where are the gaps in ethnicity? Where is the praxis? All this talking about intersectionality, where is the praxis? And so yeah, that's all I can add really. All the rest pretty much has been very succinctly said by Riwa.
Well, thank you. I'd like to now turn to Ghassan, to you and your book, which I already showed before, if you haven't seen it. So I recently read it, and the book, so I guess the sort of the main aim of the book, the way I see it, is that it very much challenges how sexuality has been used to provide this exceptional narrative about particularly contemporary Beirut and about modernity and modern Beirut. And your book, Ghassan, offers an alternative to this neoliberal narrative of, well, Lebanese, but actually more specifically Beiruti exceptionalism, right? And it highlights also very succinctly the power of everyday disruptive situations. And when I say everyday disruptive situations, I mean, the book was written before the recent state of big disruptions, multiple disruptions, and how these disruptive situations shape LGBTQ life. So at the heart of your book, as I understand it, is the unsettling of the assumption that the normal is normative. And so while you focus on Beirut, you describe a situation, al-wad, that consists of a constant series of disruptions, the lack of normality as an everyday context due to conflict, violence, economic crisis, political corruption, sectarianism, and so on. And based on the very in-depth research that you did, you're exploring queer tactics in this continued state of disruption. And you're challenging these binaries of coming out and being in the closet. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the queer tactics that are at the heart of your book.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you for this generous reading and for your questions. And thank you again for inviting us and for making this possible, and to everybody at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And it's such a pleasure and honor to be in the company of people I really look up to and the work, the transformative work that they're doing. So thank you. So to actually, I'll pick up your question from where I think Rewa started. And my book, what I attempted to do with the book before I talk about the queer tactics and why queer tactics become central is kind of demonstrate that it's not another study on gay life or gay Beirut. That's not what I was trying to do, which is not what, you know, Euro-American readers want to read, because what sells is a book with queer people holding hands, you know. So I was trying to resist that, to say that actually my analysis is the queer strategies that come from something that I embodied and experienced, which I did not come up with the term al-wada, but I'm going to explicate al-wada a little bit and kind of explain why the Beirut explosion is not just another manifestation of al-wada. So the book briefly just examines queer life, but not necessarily linked to LGBT life. So I kind of make a distinction between a queer situation that becomes normalized. And that's, I think, Nadia's, your question about the normal versus the normative, is what happens when the non-normative becomes the normative state of life. That's where I begin my question, and that's where I kind of end. Another thing that I do is I though I employ queer theory and queer of color critique, I also show their failures. And my entry point with it was that queer theory cannot account uh, to what's happening in Beirut because it always assumes a normative that we need to disrupt. So my question at the heart of the book is what happens when, instead of just applying queer theoretical um, notions, so I disidentify, in the words of Munoz, from queer theory and queer of color critique and find an entryway to say that what is the role of queer theory or queer activism, again, when we're trying to uh, shake up or upset the status quo or disrupt when disruption is what is normative. So that's kind of where my entry point is. And to be very honest, the book is a product of what Riwa was talking about, of what I saw as failures in my own research. Everything that I thought should not go into the dissertation, everything that I thought I was failing, I was being re-traumatized by every, so I did the research mostly in 2013, 14 during every ISIL suicide bombing. Can I actually do this research? Ethnographers are supposed to go do the, the heroic masculinist kind of white assumption of it. And I wasn't that person. So everything that I considered to be a failure was what I made into the book. So the queer tactics, just a few more words about al-wada. So al-wada is the Arabic equivalent for the word situation. And it can only be understood by people who live al-wada. Al-wada, Riwa would kind of understand exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's a condition, or it's a nebulous term. It's just the situation. There's no connotation whether it's positive or negative. So unlike thinking about words like conflict, or words, if we think about Northern Ireland, the troubles, al-wada is neutral. But al-wada, similarly to al-ahdath, which is the civil war, the events, what happens? What does al-wada do? So al-wada for me is the situation that is always disruptive. So the title fails me a little bit, but I had to come up with a title that can sell. So al-wada is always disruptive. There isn't a time when al-wada is not disruptive in the context of Beirut and Lebanon, actually. It has no clear beginning, has no clear end. It continues its shape shifting, it takes on different forms, but the only consistent thing about it is that it's always ever present and shapes our lives. Uh, so, um, so the period when I was doing the research, marked by a series of political deadlocks, more corruption, garbage crisis. I mean, I can go on and on. But the port explosion and what's happening in Beirut now in Lebanon, sorry, I have to not just, the book is about Beirut, uh, is not just another manifestation of al-wada. It's something bigger, I think. But language fails in translating what al-wada is. Because language fails in translating, I turn to affect in the book. I wanted the people to feel, I wanted to throw the reader into al-wada, to feel the discomfort that I feel, to feel discomfort that a lot of my interlocutors, friends, and family feel. So affect does not fail us in that, though words do fail. So instead of doing a study on LGBT practices or gay life, which again is not my interest, is I thought, okay, how do people navigate everyday life disruptions, including myself? And it so happened to be that the project started with working with queer identified persons. It changed to thinking about what are the queer strategies that people do in navigating these everyday life disruptions, including myself, as both a diasporic kind of person and as a person who's living in two worlds at the same time constantly. So the queer tactics, which I'll give you a couple of examples about as you ask, they gesture towards a more expansive understanding of queerness that does not have to do with LGBTQ identities. Queer strategies are enacted by people that are not quote unquote queer. And I try not to use queer as a descriptive. It is a verb. It's a queer strategy that people in Lebanon have to uh, use in order to navigate these disruptions. And again, something that Sabiha raised that I might just want to add something to is that by zooming in, so the book is a series of zooming in and out, kind of thinking about space and geographies of exceptionalism. I really ask, what does everyday queer tactics tell us about the local and regional and geopolitical questions? So instead of starting from the geopolitical, I take the everyday, the micro, the experiences of checkpoints to actually explain what's happening at a macro level. So each chapter of mine actually looks at one kind of queer strategy, and I'll very briefly just mention two. One is anti-reconciliation. It's a queer tactic that people have to use in response to this call for reconciling parts of ourselves that seem to not fit well together. It's also a queer strategy of not lack of reconciliation, which I borrow from post-war conflict studies, that we don't have any reconciliation. I think reconciliation at the end of the day can fail populations. I'm happy to talk more about that. We don't have a shared history. But the fact that one does not reconcile, does not need to reconcile these contradictions, the fact that we live in the mess and we feel with the mess is what I was trying to get at. But there's always the question, the popular question, how do you identify as, how does it sit well that you're queer, Muslim, working class? That's just another way of asking, make a sense, the presentation of a coherent self or a coherent experience. So by refusing to reconcile and by refusing to look at queer life, and here again, queer life expansively thinking, through the refusal of reconciliation is one queer tactic that I talk about. It's not a failure, it's a queer tactic. Another one that I talk about is the fact that people do not ascribe to LGBT visibility as we think about. We are always visible. Again, our flesh, our bodies, we are visible on the streets, not simply as queer people, but we're visible based again on our accents, right? Where we're stopped. Again, what do we do when we're at a checkpoint? Who gets stopped and who doesn't? And what does that mean? What queer strategies do we also perform at the checkpoint? And they're gendered and classed mostly is what I'm trying to say. How do we access space is another concept. And then what is the bubble? I talk about the formation of a bubble that actually can sometimes, for those who have the privilege to live in a bubble, reproduce these neoliberal narratives of Beiruti exceptionalism. So there are, the government does that, people do that, that's how they sell. And that's Rewa's point about consumption. Beirut becomes a site to be consumed by the Gulf, the Arab Gulf, by Euro-American companies and gays, particularly white gay men. And here I will end here, is to think about, to link it to the last question that you asked Rewa and Sabiha, if I may, is that these queer strategy, I found myself enacting them, and I wanted to rethink, possibly, that's not in the book, but I'm starting to think about the idea of protest. And what if we untangle the notion of protest through a queer theoretical perspective, not seeing protest only as masses, as collectives, but every day, these queer tactics are in and of themselves acts of protest, which I'm happy to talk about more. But if we take these small, again, what do you do at a checkpoint? That in and of itself is a queer act of protest and a queer activist. You don't have to have the label of an activist. And I am not an activist, so I'm not trying to, and I'm just trying to think with, as opposed to talk about. And I guess that's, so what the last thing I'd say, one way I do it in the book, or the decolonizing move that I try to do, is by all my interlocutors become in the index. All my interlocutors are authors. Instead of putting the names of a lot of theorists, I removed a lot of theorists that don't need more visibility. But my interlocutors' names, their pseudonyms, are in the index because they are the knowledge producers that made this possible, not me. So I'll end with this, and I'm happy to engage more. I hope this answered your question.
Yeah. No, it did. I mean, one of the things that I found, there were so many things I found super interesting, but the way you actually give some examples of people who express the difficulties of strategizing, and you call it a form of queer strategizing when they have to, for example, express their political views, which are, very awkward in certain situations. So, based on someone's sectarian identity and class background, you are not supposed to have that view on Palestinians, for example, right? So that, I think that was really interesting, the way you are employing queer strategies. Maybe later on we can go back to that. I see there's a question in the audience, but I'd like to, at this point, to actually move on, because the second part, of course, of the title of your book mentioned this word fractal Orientalism. And, those of us who are teaching a course on the Middle East, very happy about, before publishing this book, you had an article in which you introduced the term. And I think it is such a great way to really complicating our understanding of Orientalism, which is, the Western representation of, we're thinking of the Middle East and, all the stereotypes and the homogenization and equating the Middle East with Islam and all this, but you are really complicating that and providing a kind of macro analytical framework to analyze, the specific situations. And I was wondering if you could explain this concept of fractal Orientalism to us, which I found very compelling.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That means so much to me. Thank you. So the idea for this concept started in a kind of funny, it was 2009, just to kind of clarify where I started thinking about this. So quite some time ago. But I came across, I had just moved to the US for grad studies, and I came across this article calling Beirut the province town of the Middle East. I didn't know what province town was, so I had to Google it, right? And as I always say, I ended up going there, and Beirut is more fun. So still, it's not the province town of the Middle East, but Provincetown, for those who don't know, is a town in the Cape Cod, Massachusetts, that is a queer, kind of gay, lesbian destination, and where a lot of authors, gay and queer authors lived. So I started doing all this research to find this ongoing trend from 2005 onwards, right after the Syrian troops withdrawal from Lebanon. So after the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, or the physical occupation, right? All of a sudden, there were all these articles claiming Beirut is a new gay destination, as if with that leaving, oh, now we're moving into a more progressive state of affairs. And obviously these articles that I kept finding, written by white gay men, European-based and US-based, and I started gathering gay travel logs. Women don't exist. There's a total erasure of any of women, of genderqueer persons, of trans individuals. It was just about gay kind of encounters that they have in Lebanon and in Beirut particularly. And not only was I struck, and it was so uncomfortable, because I started, so what does it mean to think of Beirut as a gay space? And that's reflecting on my own life. I'm like, wow, they're describing things I never thought could actually happen. So I invite, for those who want to have fun, maybe to read these pieces, because not only are they, so I thought Orientalism doesn't capture it. It's not East, it wasn't just like what we understand as Orientalism, or even Neo-Orientalism, which I build on also Asif Bayat's notion of Neo-Orientalism. But I found that what happens is that, so fractals, just let me explain fractals a little bit. Fractals are nested dichotomies. So they are a pattern that keeps repeating itself across multiple levels infinitely. And they're simple geometric patterns. And I borrowed that from biology and physics and math. And I don't know anything about these, but I tried reading them. And what fractals do is they keep repeating themselves, and fractals are found in nature, but they're hard to find in nature. So in branches of trees, snowflakes are fractals, things that we don't pay attention to. So I said, there's something more that I'm seeing. It's not simply Beirut is cosmopolitan versus, or Lebanon is cosmopolitan versus the rest of the Arab world. The cosmopolitan kind of notion was Beirut only became gay friendly in relation to other Arab countries, not in relation to other spaces. So instead of centering European or US cities, I wanted to center how does Beirut become exceptional, or Lebanon, sorry. And then I found that the same exact binary is multi-layered and is being applied from the level of, Arab world, Euro-American spaces. Then if you look back, it's the same verbs, it's the same adjectives. Beirut versus the rest of Lebanon. Within Beirut, Christians versus Muslims. Within that, so it was the same binary. And that binary is not just imposed because I grew up hearing these, how we also self-orientalize and use fractal Orientalism. So I wanted to track how it is being used in Beirut. And in fact, it continues being used among a lot of people, especially among, for the lack of a better term, LGBT communities that assume there's one way of being queer, one legitimate queerness, and other queer formations is not legitimate. Another thing to think about it is that class becomes so central when we think about, because class and sect are very tied together in Lebanon. Who gets to theorize, even again, questions about, to take it out of the context of the book, is to just think about who gets to theorize versus who gets to only speak as a native informant. And I'm still called upon to just speak as a native informant. I'm not expected to do any kind of theory. And that's because I come from a working class background. I'm not your typical academic from the Middle East who comes from material wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to really unpack the fact that it's not simple and it's being circulated in Lebanon. And what Fractal Orientalism does is also erases the precarity, erases al-wad. And in the book, you'll see that, the southern suburbs are seen as not being able, there's no art, there's nothing in the southern suburbs for you to see. But if you go to this neighborhood, art is flourishing. Even the language of avenues versus streets, when they're exactly the same. It's just fascinating to see Sunni Shia distinctions, etc. And I can go on and on. But I really wanted to centralize class because class is missing from our discussions of LGBT issues in the Middle East. So I'll stop here.
I think that's such an important point. And thanks so much. I would like to pick up on, one of the strands and also actually ask Riva and Sabiha to comment on that. You mentioned this question about, who can theorize, who has the authority to theorize. And we know that, the Middle East is regularly used as the object of queer studies. But clearly, part of the project that you're doing is, collectively, is the attempt to decenter, what is regularly constructed as authoritative knowledge. That is Western academic knowledge production. And as you say, Ghassan, it's, it's not only that it's Western, but it's tends to be associated with particular social class as well. So I guess I'm going to ask Riva and Sabiha to comment on, the question how your respective work forces us to rethink more established queer studies approaches. Maybe Sabiha, if you want to start.
Yes, Nadia. I think my answer would be a little bit of a synthesis of what we've been saying over the past 60 minutes. And I think, because it's evidently going to tie back to activism, praxis, theory, etc. And if there's something willful, when you want to write about a new world, right? A new possibility, a new futurity, a new everything. When you adopt Ronak Kapadia calls it queer calculus. It's a queer calculus. It's a queer strategy. You read between the line. It's willful. You're always stirring trouble, but you're also trying to extract that, you know, which is not being said. You pay more attention to the silences, you pay more attention to the erasures, and everybody can theorize. Everybody can theorize. This is like unquestionable to me. And I think everyone who has, you know, there's this point when you do queer theory, but also feminist, like feminist knowledge, you know, letting go of all these binaries, of all these myths, of all these neat arrangements. And I always call it a one-way route, like you never look back. It's one way. Everything from now on is going to be more critiquing, more deconstructing, more showing the links between very distinct, events. Last week, for example, in my Middle East topics, we were doing the topic of the war on terror, and my queer willfulness was to, for example, link the killing of a young white British woman, Sarah Everard, to the war in terrorism, right? By relying on IR feminists like Cynthia Coburn and talking about gendered continuums of violence. I could have completely ignored, right, the death and done, and, you know, just adopted the more conventional way of talking about terrorism studies and sexuality. But no. And so, yeah, it's really about being willful, and it almost becomes like a second skin to you, right? It's not something that, and if it doesn't feel like a second skin, it means there's still work, you know, that needs to be done. Yeah.
Thanks, Sabiha. Riva?
Yeah. Uh, so in the question who can theorize, there's also the question of how we theorize. And I think, you know, they both come together in the sense that who can theorize in the authoritarian sense can also decide how we theorize, and therefore who is talked about and in what terms. So it's really setting, I mean, it's true in a way, because we carry theory in our bodies, in our flesh, everybody can theorize, but it's also about how does this theory get circulated? How does it, you know, spread in the world? And I want to go back to what Ghassan was saying in terms of whom do we cite? It's a queer praxis. Whom do we, like, this decision is also about how we theorize. And there's a lot of, I mean, we always get asked, we got asked this a lot, Sabiha, during the launch event, and I see there's a question that is similar, like, what can we do within institutions, right? Like, how is it that we can bring this queer praxis to institutions, to queer studies within academia? And so citational paths is one way. Like, why do we want to keep bringing the same, like, old in the sense, like, not age but, you know, that are like hundreds of years old, like white theorists into the conversation, when these conversations are happening in different ways, not just as conversations that are, you know, written out there, but that are also lived and that are part of people's lived realities that they can reflect on. So what we choose to bring is how we theorize in a way. And I want to go back a little bit to this idea of, you know, I'm trying to think of the prefixes like de and decenter of, or decolonial, or re and reclaim and reappropriate. And I think of what they hide in terms of power, because decentering, we want decentering to be centering something else, but often we end up just staying at the decentering. So going back to the idea of wandering off, when we center something else instead of decenter, although I understand the importance of decentering, of decolonizing, etc., then what we are doing is we are thinking of a different mode of theorizing that does not rely only on the erosion of what we know as a system of power, as a system of knowledge, and as a system of theory. And maybe one last point, academia like as a broad category has always been accused of holding this authoritarian knowledge, but in light of at least what's going on in France right now, you know, in terms of, you know, the repression from the state, on the French Academy and French universities in general. What I'd like to say is that academia is not this homogeneous whole, and there are considerations to take to keep in mind, like Ghassan was saying, in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of migration status. And those make a big difference in academia, because the state, nation, like border control states are complicit in reifying what knowledge gets out there and what doesn't. And this is very apparent right now in what I'm living, in terms of, you know, like the French Minister of Higher Education and Research, Higher Education Research and Innovation, accused universities of being hubs of Islamo-leftism, pointing to intersectional theories, decolonial theories, gender theories in general. And what is meant by that is people who are who are not white and who engage in decolonial praxis that are queer and that resist, you know, this kind of narrative. So there's always resistance. Like, everybody theorizes, but we theorize with our resistance, and with keeping in mind that thinking of those different nodes and sites of power is what can then constitute what, you know, Sarah Ahmed calls a counter-institutional archive, with the institution being something that we encounter and that we live, whose rule we live under, in a way.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's so important, Riva, to, within the wider critique of, well, the privileging of especially Western academic knowledge production, the recognition that we cannot and we should not homogenize Western academic knowledge production. I mean, you're speaking about France, you know, Ghassan and myself are currently based in the US. And I mean, it is not a coincidence that higher education was under a tremendous attack under the Trump administration. I mean, that was horrendous what was going on there. Sabiha is in the UK, where, you know, I lived for 25 years and I was working at SOAS. And, you know, the Tory government was also using the prevent agenda, which was supposedly this anti-terrorist agenda, to try to crack down on you know, academic freedom, and specifically, of course, focusing on anything linked to Palestine or Islam. And we know that academics, both in terms of course, student mobilization, but also faculty, you know, have been resisting and have been linked to political struggles historically. And in some places, it's more obvious. I mean, if you look at South Africa, you know, look at, you know, Palestine, this distinction is in and of itself problematic in many contexts. So I really appreciate your intervention and complicating, you know, that binary. I have a question that's sort of burning in terms of your diasporic positionalities, and also the question of transnational queer networks. But before I ask you all that question, I actually want to turn to the Q&A. And there are a couple of questions to three of you, and you don't have to answer all of them, but maybe you can choose one of them, and I will then also answer one of the questions. So one question is by Lily Q, who asks, how can queer studies in universities and colleges be reconstructed to better include today's worldviews? And then Wishdan Ben Shaban is asking, what is concretely meant by queer strategy? Keegan Tarek says, if it would not distract from this panel's primary focus, could you tell us more about your decision to have panelists speak in English while providing anonymous Arabic interpretation? What sorts of practical and theoretical questions did you face in making this decision? I greatly appreciate your thoughtfulness and efforts here. So I'm going to answer that question quickly, Keegan, which is because I'm kind of responsible for organizing this. Well, I mean, I guess the most obvious answer is that I'm here in the US at Brown University, and so the default is English. But I, since I started as director of the Center for Middle East Studies in September, I noticed that, you know, when you have these online webinars, it is actually possible to reach people who are not in the US. We actually started to have more and more people in the Middle East, and I started to notice how numbers went up, 300, 400, 500 people. And I thought it's really a shame that people who don't speak English, are not able to actually follow. And that's why I decided to have Arabic translation, which is not easy. We've had lots of failures in the past. So hopefully this time it works better. I hope that answers your question. So would anyone like to answer any of the other two questions?
Sure, I'm happy to say something if that kind of asks the question about queer studies in universities. I just want to just highlight something very quickly, just to add on Rewa and Sabiha's points about theory. And I just kind of remember that not just that everybody can theorize, but when we think about theory and put it in a conversation with queer theory, or think about queer of color critique that has its origins, and thinking about people like James Baldwin, like Audre Lorde as the Combahee River Collective, as actually where theorizing started. So here I think of Bell Hooks' theory as liberatory practice, that anybody can theorize, or Diane Millian, the indigenous scholar who talks about felt knowledge. So we can theorize in multiple ways. I do want to say to the question about queer theory is that queer theory is also an umbrella term and is not homogeneous. And I still do find, sadly, that we are complicit in citational practices, whether it doesn't have to be white queer scholars. The usual suspects are the ones we keep citing, and not kind of citing newer work or work that pushes against. So while queer theory can give us this avenue, I do feel that we are still complicit in citational practices, because it's always, and I call them the usual suspects, people at top schools, people at Ivy Leagues, people who have made it, and again, without thinking of how people, what passports they have, as Rewa was talking about, what networks they have, and how that happened to who becomes an expert and who becomes not. But queer theory definitely can help us. But again, what queer theory is my question? There are multiple queer theories.
Yeah, thank you. Riva, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
Yeah, I mean, this question of queer studies in universities and colleges be reconstructed to better include today's worldviews. And I think it's a broader issue of institutions. Maybe Sabiha can reflect on that better, because I'm still thankfully outside of an academic institution, except for my studies. But I really think it's about this idea of engagement and circulation. So who are we engaging with at many levels? So even at the level of the syllabus, who are we teaching? Who are we giving the space to? And like I've been working with Sabiha and a friend of ours, Sophie, like sometimes we really think about what it means to bring different, although it, I'm just on the side, but to bring different voices to the syllabus that would not be seen in an academic institution usually. So really to engage with discourse that is being already engaged with in other parts of the world, but also other parts of not just in terms of geographies, but also other parts that are not academic. So how is it that we can do this care work? It's care work to bring it in. And then how can we link it? Because, I mean, to reflect also on the workshop, what we did was really this deconstructing the self so that we can insert ourselves back into our narratives. And that was like, in a way, it was such a cathartic, but also painful experience. And so it's really like maybe allowing ourselves to go through this cathartic pain in a sense. And my understanding, although I'm also outside of that, is that a lot of queer studies work in institution is also about care work with the students. And we have a great article written by Akanksha Mehta on the subject of how people of color within institutions end up engaging in those loops of care, like giving care to students as a queer praxis. And maybe Sabiha has more to say about that than I do. Yeah. Is there another question that I can't see them anymore, they disappeared.
Oh, sorry, I put them, but I think it's fine.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. Sabiha, would you like to add something in terms of the kind of institutional context?
Yes, actually, I would like to add, because it's one aspect of the conversation that sometimes we forget. So absolutely, there's a lot of imbalance in terms of who does, in terms of the pedagogy, the work between teacher and student. But we also sometimes forget the colleagues, like you also have to find a way, I think, to spread the workload and the emotional labor between you and your colleagues. And this is particularly important in this time and age of academia, where lots of my colleagues are on fractional contracts, are on part-time contracts, and like someone has to do the job, and if you have a better contract, for me, it's not you don't think about it. You take on a bigger load and you deal with it, and so yeah, it just becomes caring becomes pedagogy indeed. And the last thing I wanted to add is you said something about the diasporic, or
No, we'll do that later. The diasporic, we'll do that later.
I don't know,
That
for
will be
some
my
people
last question to all of you.
right,
No.
right.
Yeah, I just like to say something about the question, because I guess I would find it really difficult to answer the question, because I don't think we can assume that we all have the same worldview. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's becoming more and more apparent is that everywhere in the world we get this sort of polarized worldviews, and of course in between there's a continuum, and it's more complex, and polarization, we want to move away from binaries, of course, that's the whole idea. But sort of broadly speaking, we have it's when I look to the UK, I look to Iraq, I look to Egypt, I look to the US, there are these polarized views. And especially when it comes to, of course, queer issues, on the one hand, you have, more and more people who, I guess, adhere to a worldview that allows for sort of greater openness to take on board the challenge to heteronormativity, and who recognize the importance of, gender and sexuality, to understand all kinds of phenomena, and who also understand that, if you aspire to a better world, so to speak, a more just world, you have to put gender and sexuality at its center, and the intersectionalities. And then you have, everywhere we look, you have people who are actually very, very, very strongly rejecting and pushing against that, and anti-gender discourse, homophobia, hacking down on the values of the family, and the most sort of conservative ways, and various forms of religious fundamentalisms across the religious denominations. So I'm not quite sure what worldview we are talking about. I think that's a problem, and that's where we see also, of course, some of the debates. Before I'm going to ask the last question, I was wondering, Ghassan, if you could briefly, very briefly, just say a few sentences about the question, someone asked, so what do you concretely mean by queer strategy?
So thank you for that. Very briefly and concretely is hard, but I will.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's impossible.
I will do it in one sentence so that people can buy the book. Basically, it's strategies that are non-normative. That strategies that people have to use that are non-normative, that seem counterintuitive, that go against what we think somebody should do in a certain situation, but that allow for survival. That's my succinct.
Great. Anyone would like to add a sentence or two, or you're happy with that very succinct definition? No? Okay. So then what I was referring to Sabiha in terms of the question that I had is, when I'm thinking about, so you're all three of you are currently living in so-called Western contexts. So Riva in Paris, Sabiha in Cornwall in the UK, and Ghassan, you're living in Illinois and a place called Champaign. Is that right? Do I pronounce it correctly? I'm still, my sort of geography of the US is still very bad.
It's not the champagne that we like. It's
no. So yeah, I'm curious to know if you could sort of share your reflections and your experiences in terms of the challenges. I assume that there are challenges linked to your diasporic positionalities, but also thinking around, some of the potential openings. And the final question that I'd have to, I would like to address to all of you is the question of, if you're involved in any transnational queer networks, and if so, if you can speak a little bit about that. So Riva, would you like to start?
Sure. I have to say though that the first time I saw that question, I did a double take because it's so recent that I came to France that I still don't see myself as diasporic. So it was a bit of a shock to read myself in this way, but I guess here we are. Maybe I'd like to reflect a little bit on a story that illustrates, when we registered Kahal in Lebanon, we had to find an official name for it. And we went for intersectional knowledge publishers. And the reason for that is that intersectional is not as flagged or, as shocking to, the state or whatever as feminist would be or gay would be. And so we went with that word, thinking that we were being discreet. And then we came to France with that same name. And I was shocked to find that intersectional is actually what really makes you stand out, in terms of, the intersectionals. So like they're the people who do all the anti-racism, the queer work, etc., and who are feminist and annoying and all of that. And so it's a bit to talk about the dissonance, that happens in terms of disorientations from one place to the other. And I'm saying this because it has like real implications, material implications in terms of the research that we do on the one hand, but also the knowledge and the transnational conversations that we might have. So I remember, Nadia, you and I and other people as well had so many conversations about our issues with explaining everything away by pointing to, let's say, imperialism or neoliberalism. So that explains, let's say, the problem with what's going on in Lebanon right now, and full stop. And I think being here, being diasporic, although I'm still not sure that this is the label that fits me, I think I kind of understood why this work is being done within the states, like nation states that are, Western, quote unquote, themselves. So pointing to imperialism under empire, when we're within this side of power, pointing to institutionalization under its institutions. So I think I understand where it's coming from, but I also understand the problem better. And the problem is that it's counterproductive to translate these frameworks transnationally and then expect people under global South nation states to subscribe to these frameworks and considerations. And just, so even, and it is a question of phenomenology. When we are orientated towards something, the idea of queer phenomenology is then to look back. And I think in a lot of times in these considerations, we do not really look back. So it's like an application that becomes transnational. But that's not the transnational conversation that I would like to have or that I would like us to have. It's not one that is, dominated by identity politics, and definitely not by nation state logic, because that's exactly what happens. Those are the dissonances and absences that happen when it's broken down for us and we're just confined to, our conditions and our here and now, that is under, the rule of this nation state or the other. And breaking free from that is not to forget that there are material conditions, that make our lives, many of our lives, unlivable. Uh, but it is, how is it that we can then create alternative circulations that are not about transposing frameworks, but that are about bringing multiple frameworks together, that are queer and decolonial, so that we can be with our dissonance and our mass, and form a kind of transnational resistance in that respect. I'm not in an official network, but I'm hoping that we as Kohol and myself are in networks to be, because it's transnational work is really part of, what we are looking towards, our phenomenology of the moment, let's say.
Yes, yes. And I mean, I guess as much as, we have missed the kinds of encounters and spaces that Sabiha was describing when she was talking about the queer writing workshop in Beirut, where, the coffee and the cookies, are important context, and the physicality of, eating together. But I guess the positive side, when if want to find the silver lining in terms of this new way of relating to each other, talking to each other because of the pandemic, is that of course there was transnational links before and solidarities, but somehow it has sort of crystallized the possibility and has made the connections in some ways more tangible. But of course it is not just about, and we had this discussion, Riva, didn't we? It's not just about the mechanics or the methods of transnational networks. It's about the kinds of politics that is linked to that, and kinds of intersectional politics, and what might be relevant in one empirical context in terms of the specific intersectional power configurations might not be in another context. And so the ability, first of all, to do our homework, but also to be sensitive to these differences, I think is really important. So Ghassan, would you like to comment on the question, respond?
Yeah, just very briefly. I know Sabiha has something to say about it. That what I here's the opening and the constraint. That's what I found. That the constraint obviously is that we live multiple lives. We're in more than one place at the same time. At least I am and have been for over a decade. Uh, but the distance does help in being able to kind of sit with certain things, but it's also not an easy. And again, I'm not trying to romanticize it. It's really actually a harsh reality. The openings, though, is what I want to focus on. Is that you create linkages, you create more kind of allyships with other racialized, minoritized subjects that you didn't think there is so much of a connection with, and you kind of speaking from centers of empire really changes. Obviously, we're very policed, and one thing that academia does, especially on the tenure track, is it doesn't allow you. You have so much work that activism, you don't even have time to do the activism, because as Sabiha was saying, a lot of us are actually doing all the emotional labor that is gendered, that is sexual. It's so we're doing that. So I did, when I was in grad school, did start a group with a couple of other diasporic Arab um, queer individuals called the Arab Queer Collective, as a response, as more of a space of kind of an intellectual space, dialogue. Not going to go into detail; it doesn't exist anymore, sadly. But I just do want to say that the opening is really great, but there is also a lot of pushback because we are seen as homogenous, as if we all have the same privileges, being in the ivory tower, and that is not true. That's one thing I keep feeling when I go back to what happens when the field is your home, right? But we do not all occupy the same positions of privilege just because it looks like it from the outside. But
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Ghassan. Sabiha?
I got very intrigued by this question because unfortunately, I found that I was able to find my story, my truth, my erased history, my real roots, you know, when I moved to the UK. In the sense that who was going to tell me, right, about Orientalism, unless you were from a very particular intellectual class, no one was going to tell you about Orientalism. Well, my father was an intellect, but he was very depressed. And I lost so many opportunities. I could have discussed so many things with him, but it didn't happen and it wasn't meant to happen. Yeah, so Frantz Fanon, I remember his book, you know, lying around the house, but no one told me what they were. And it took, you know, coming, it's so paradoxical. It took coming to the UK, embracing exile to a certain extent, to be able to come to terms with the magnitude of the violence, you know, that colonialism has exerted, that imperialism continues to exert, but also the possibilities made by technology. And man, I mean, with COVID, who hasn't had, you know, at least one webinar every other day, excellent webinars, excellent activists, artists, colleagues, peers, you know, from other universities, like just doing this disseminating work, people following. And I guess, yeah, these are the, and you know, when I express myself this way, I find it very easy to tell people, stop telling me that if you don't like it, go home. Actually, it's exactly because of this that I'm going to fight even more and more and more and more, you know, while I'm here. Whether it's about the silencing of academics, the brutalizing of women when they go in the middle of a pandemic. But I mean, come on, Sarah Everard was killed by policemen, right? But I also tell my students, it was Sisters Uncut, right, who made the work. It was a very intersectional, grassroots, queer feminist organization that did the work to bring people out of their houses. It wasn't Reclaim the Street. It wasn't this, it wasn't that. So yeah,
Yeah.
these are, I think I would leave it there.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And unfortunately, we've actually come to the end of this really interesting conversation. I mean, I'm hoping so. Just for those of you who are listening in, just to let you know that. So the journal, of course, we are referring to is a Journal of Body and Gender Research, and that journal is available online. It's freely accessible, and it's speaking of language, I think it's really important to stress it's available in both English and Arabic. So if you haven't yet had a chance, so the new issue on queer feminisms just came out, but there's also the archive of all the previous issues of the last 5 years. And certainly I've been using many articles from the journal in my classes, and the students always really appreciate them. And yes, certainly I also encourage you to read Ghassan's book, which is not only, you know, very interesting and makes an important contribution, but it's actually also really good read. And I appreciate that it's accessible and it's not sort of too jargony, but it's really great. So I'd like to thank you all.
I just put a discount code on the chat for everybody. If anybody
okay.
then buying the book.
Right. Let me just quickly put that discount because I don't think people can see that. I'll put it in the Q&A.
Okay.
Actually, I don't know.
It does say to panelists and attendees, so it must.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, they can. Okay, they can. So great. Okay, well, thank you all. And thank you for all of those who attended. I mean, we make the recording available online so you can tell your peers and friends and colleagues. So yes, and I'm hoping that we'll, of course, pick up this conversation, which is an ongoing one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.